They auctioned a human being on a Thursday morning, not in secret, not in darkness. In the middle of the main street of Red Hollow, Texas, in full daylight, with 24 people watching, and not one of them said a word. She was 20 years old. Her wrists were bound with rope. She stood on cracked earth under a merciless sun while a man in a brown suit called a price over her head and waited to see who would buy her future. The crowd was silent. Not because they didn't know it was wrong, because knowing something is wrong and doing something about it are two entirely different kinds of courage. And most people, when the moment arrives, discover they only have the first kind. This is the story of the ones who had both. If this story moves you, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about the price of a person's worth. Red Hollow, Texas. Summer, 1882. The sun had no mercy in Red Hollow. It pressed down on the town like a flat iron on linen, heavy, relentless, burning away anything soft or green or alive. The main street, if you could still call it that, was a wide corridor of cracked brown earth flanked by storefronts that hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in years. The general store, the farrier, a saloon that did most of its business before noon, a church whose bell had gone silent after the rope rotted through and no one bothered to replace it. It hadn't rained in 41 days. The old-timers said they'd seen dry spells before. They said Texas always came back. But this drought was different, the kind that didn't just kill crops. It killed hope. It dried up patience. It turned neighbors into strangers and strangers into threats. Wells that had given water for 20 years had turned to dust at the bottom. Livestock were dying in the fields. Families were leaving in the night, wagons piled with whatever they could carry, heading west toward rumors of better land, better luck, anything better than this. The ones who stayed were the stubborn, the desperate, and the ones with nowhere else to go. Clara Whitfield was all three. She had come to Red Hollow 8 months earlier with her father, James Whitfield, a man who carried ambition the way some men carry disease, quietly, invisibly, until it was too late to treat. He had spoken of a new life, a fresh start, a parcel of land that a man named Denton Cole had written to him about. He had read her the letter a dozen times on the journey from Missouri. Fertile soil, good water, opportunity for a man willing to work. James Whitfield had been willing to work. What he had not been willing to do was read the fine print of a contract drawn up by a man who made his living off the desperation of others. The land Silas Dodd sold them was worthless. The well was dry before they dug 3 feet. The soil was caliche and rock. Within 3 months, James Whitfield had borrowed more money from Dodd than he could ever repay. Seed money, they called it, though nothing ever grew. He borrowed against the wagon, against the mule, against the tools. And then, on a Tuesday evening in March, James Whitfield sat down on the porch of the shack he'd built with borrowed lumber, looked out at the dead field he'd broken his back trying to coax to life, and simply stopped. The doctor said it was his heart. Clara knew it was something else, something that doesn't have a medical name, something that happens when a man's will finally gives out, when the distance between what he dreamed and what is real becomes too vast to cross. She buried him on a Wednesday, alone. The neighbors came to look, but not to help. What followed was worse than grief. Grief, at least, is clean. What Clara faced was the particular cruelty of debt. Silas Dodd appeared at her door 2 days after the burial, dressed in a brown suit that was too good for Red Hollow and too small for his thickening frame. He was a man in his mid-40s, with a face that arranged itself into expressions of sincerity the way a card shark arranges his hands, deliberately, for maximum effect. "Miss Whitfield," he said, removing his hat with practiced courtesy, "I hate to call on you at such a sorrowful time. Truly, I do." Clara had looked at him through the doorway and said nothing. "But business," he continued, "has its own calendar. Your father's debts, and they were considerable, I'm afraid, they don't pause for mourning. The law's the law." "What debts?" she asked. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "He borrowed against things you already own." Dodd's expression shifted. Just slightly, just enough. "He borrowed against his labor," the man said. "And his labor, Miss Whitfield, was contracted to me. Which means, by extension, say what you mean, Mr. Dodd." He said it plainly. He always said things plainly when he'd already won. He held a contract, a thing her father had signed in the desperate blur of his first weeks in Red Hollow, that bound the labor of his household to Silas Dodd until the debt was repaid. The contract was almost certainly fraudulent. Clara knew it. But she also knew that the nearest lawyer was 60 miles away, that the sheriff of Red Hollow owed Dodd money, and that in 1882, a 20-year-old woman alone in a Texas frontier town had approximately the legal standing of a fence post. She had tried to fight it. She had written letters that went unanswered. She had gone to the sheriff, who looked at the contract, looked at her, and looked away. She had worked, cooking, mending, hauling water, to pay off what she could. But Dodd kept adjusting the numbers, adding fees and interest with the casual creativity of a man who had never been held accountable for anything in his life. By June, she owed more than she had when she started, and Silas Dodd had grown tired of waiting. She heard about it from the blacksmith's wife, a sturdy German woman named Helga Braun, who was one of the few people in Red Hollow who had ever spoken to Clara without pity or contempt. "He's saying things," Helga told her, leaning over the fence between their properties, her voice low. "In the saloon. About you. About the debt." "What kind of things?" Helga pressed her lips together. "He's saying he's going to sell the contract to whoever wants it." She paused. "Silas is calling it an auction." Clara stood very still. The word landed somewhere in her chest and sat there, cold and heavy. "He can't do that," she said. Helga looked at her with eyes that had seen enough of the world to know better. "He thinks he can," she said quietly, "and no one's going to tell him different." They held it on a Thursday morning, in the space between the general store and the post office, where the street widened enough for a small crowd to gather. The day was already brutal before 9 o'clock, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and turns the horizon into a liquid thing. A few dozen people stood in loose clusters, not quite watching, not quite looking away. Clara was brought out by one of Dodd's hired men, a wide-shouldered, flat-eyed young man named Cutter, who held her arm the way you'd hold a piece of livestock you were moving from one pen to another. Her wrists were bound with rope, not tight enough to hurt, but tight enough to make a statement, tight enough so that everyone watching would understand what this was. She was wearing the same brown dress she'd worn to her father's funeral. It was the best thing she owned. She kept her chin up. She had decided, somewhere between waking that morning and being walked into the street, that she would not let them see her break. Whatever happened, whatever price was called, whatever future Silas Dodd sold her into, she would face it standing straight. It was the only power she had left, and she held on to it like a rope over a canyon. Dodd stood on an overturned crate, his brown suit soaked dark with sweat already, a paper in his hand that he waved like a deed to something valuable. "Good people of Red Hollow," he began, and his voice carried the warm, rolling cadence of a man who had learned to make wickedness sound like commerce. "What I have here is a legal labor contract, signed, witnessed, and binding under Texas law. The previous holder of this contract, one James Whitfield, has passed on to whatever reward awaits him. His daughter, Miss Clara Whitfield, has not been able to meet the terms." He paused, letting his eyes travel over the crowd. "So I am offering a transfer of this contract to a buyer in good standing. The new holder will assume Miss Whitfield's labor obligations, and in exchange will receive the full benefit of her service for a period of, we'll call it 3 years, until the debt is settled." Someone in the crowd coughed. Someone else looked at the ground. "We'll start," Dodd said, "at the price of 2 sacks of grain." Clara stared at the far end of the street, at the place where the dirt road bent around a stand of dead mesquite trees and disappeared. She focused on it with everything she had. She thought about her mother, who had died when she was 11, a quiet woman who had pressed wildflowers between the pages of books and hummed while she cooked. She thought about the schoolhouse she'd attended in Missouri, the smell of chalk and old wood, the feeling of a book opening under her hands for the first time and understanding that the world was larger than the field outside the window. She thought about everything except where she was standing. The crowd was silent. The bidding had not begun. Dodd cleared his throat. 2 sacks of grain, he repeated. "Finest labor in the county, I assure you. Educated woman, can read, write, cook, and keep a ledger." Still nothing. The silence was not mercy. Clara had lived in Red Hollow long enough to know that. The silence was cowardice dressed up as neutrality. These people would not bid, not because they thought this was wrong, but because they didn't want to be the ones responsible for making it more wrong than it already was. "Fine," Dodd said, his good humor fraying at the edges. One sack of grain to take this contract off my hands and give this young woman a... Put that paper down." The voice came from the back of the crowd. It was not a loud voice. It was not the voice of a man who needed volume to command attention. It was the kind of voice that had been forged somewhere quieter and colder than a street auction, tempered in seasons of hard work and hard silence, and absolutely, unmistakably certain of itself. The crowd parted without being asked. Elias Hart was 34 years old and built the way frontier men get built when the frontier is serious about it. Broad through the shoulders, economical in movement, with hands that showed their history in the pattern of old scars and worked-in calluses. He was not a tall man exactly, but he carried himself in a way that made the space around him feel smaller. He wore a plain gray shirt, worn boots, and a hat that had seen better years and didn't care. He walked through this gap the crowd had opened and stopped 6 feet from Silas Dodd. His eyes did not go to Clara, not yet. They stayed on Dodd. "I said put the paper down," Elias said. "This isn't commerce. You know it isn't. Everybody standing here knows it isn't." Dodd recovered quickly. He always did. "Mr. Hart," he said, spreading his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. "This is a legal proceeding. The contract is..." "Show me where in Texas law," Elias said, "a man can auction another person." "I'm not auctioning a person. I'm transferring a labor contract." "With the person standing right there," Elias said, "with her hands tied." A murmur moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Dodd's jaw tightened. "This is none of your affair, Hart. You work for the Coles. This is a private matter between..." "Everything that happens in this town is my affair," Elias said. He wasn't angry. That was the thing that made people pay attention. He wasn't performing outrage, wasn't making a speech. He was simply stating facts, the way you state the temperature or the distance to water. "I've been riding through Red Hollow for 6 years. I've watched it get smaller and harder and meaner, and I've kept my mouth shut more times than I can count. Not today." He took one step closer to Dodd. Just one. But the space between them changed. "You're going to untie her hands," Elias said. "And you're going to walk away from whatever you think you're doing here, and you're going to leave that paper on the ground." "And if I don't?" Dodd's voice had an edge to it now, the edge of a man calculating whether he had enough backing to push. Elias let the silence stretch for exactly 3 seconds. "Then I'll go get Samuel Cole," he said. "And Samuel will go get his lawyer, and his lawyer will go get that judge in Abilene who's been wanting a reason to look into your land contracts for 2 years. He tilted his head slightly. "That's the option that ends with you in a courtroom, Silas. The other option ends with you walking back to your office and pretending this morning never happened. Your choice." Silas Dodd was a man who had built his entire career on reading rooms, on knowing when to press and when to fold. He read this room now. He read the crowd who were shifting, who were starting to look at each other with the particular discomfort of people who know they've been about to witness something shameful and are relieved to have been stopped. He read Elias Hart, who was not bluffing, and he read his own position, which was shakier than he liked to admit. The fraudulent contracts, the interest schemes, the manufactured debts. A serious look from a serious lawyer could unravel a great deal. He stepped down from the crate. "This isn't over," he said quietly, for Elias alone. "Yes, it is," Elias said. "For today." Dodd picked up his paper, folded it with deliberate care, and walked away. His hired man, Cutter, looked at Elias, looked at his employers retreating back, and followed. The crowd began to disperse quickly, the way people leave the scene of an accident, anxious to put distance between themselves and their own inaction. Elias turned to Clara. She was still standing with her chin up. Her wrists were still bound. And for the first time since they'd walked her out here, her composure cracked. Not into tears, not into collapse, but into something rawer and harder than either. A look of pure, exhausted pride from a woman who had held herself together through something she should never have been asked to endure. Elias reached into his boot and produced a small folding knife. He opened it with one hand and held it up so she could see it clearly. "May I?" he asked. She looked at the knife. She looked at his face. 20 years old, and she'd already learned to read faces fast. Learned to look for the flicker behind the eyes that told you what the mouth wasn't saying. She looked at Elias Hart's face for a long moment. She nodded. He cut the rope. One clean motion. The fibers fell away from her wrists, and she brought her hands in front of her and looked at the red marks the rope had left. And she rubbed one wrist slowly, methodically, the way you do when you're trying to feel something real. "My name is Elias Hart," he said. "I'm the foreman at Silver Creek Ranch. It's about 9 miles east of here." "I know who you are," Clara said. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Everyone in Red Hollow knows who you are." "Then you know I'm not the kind of man who does things halfway," he said. "You can't stay here. Dodd will try something else. Maybe not today, but soon. I'd like to offer you a position at Silver Creek. Legitimate work, fair wages, a room of your own. Margaret Cole runs a proper household. You'd be safe." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The street was nearly empty now. The sun pressed down on everything without mercy. "Why?" she asked. Not suspiciously. Genuinely. She needed to understand. Elias folded his knife and put it back in his boot. He looked at the place in the street where Silas Dodd had been standing and then looked back at her. "Because I stood still once when I shouldn't have," he said, "and I've been trying to even that out ever since." It wasn't a complete answer. She knew it wasn't. But it was an honest one. And in Red Hollow, in the summer of 1882, honesty was rarer than rain. "I have a few things at the shack," she said. "It won't take long to pack." "Take whatever time you need," Elias said. "I'll wait." The shack was not much to look at. A single room with a dirt floor, an iron stove that listed to one side, a rope-sprung cot, and a window with no glass in it, just a square of darkness that let in the night air and the sound of coyotes. Clara had done what she could with it. There was a shelf above the cot with 4 books on it. Her mother's books, the ones that had survived the journey from Missouri, a Bible, a volume of Shakespeare, a worn copy of Jane Eyre, and a small cloth-bound book of American poetry. She took them all. She took her mother's hairbrush, the one with the ivory handle and the crack running down the middle from when it had been dropped. She took the folded letter her father had carried in his breast pocket, the one from Dodd, the one that had started all of this, because she intended to give it to a lawyer someday, when she had the means. She took the brown dress off her back and put on a gray one that was more practical. She rolled everything into a single canvas bundle and tied it with the ends of the same rope that had bound her wrists, because she had no other cord, and because it seemed right, somehow, to put that rope to a different use. She looked around the shack one last time. There was nothing here she wanted. There were things here she would never forget. The particular quality of light through that glassless window, the smell of the stove when it burned mesquite wood, the sound of her father's coughing in the dark during those last weeks. But those things don't pack. Those things follow you, or they don't, on terms you don't control. She picked up her bundle and walked out the door and did not look back. Elias was waiting where he said he'd be, in the shade of the post office, holding the reins of 2 horses, his own, a dark bay, and a smaller pinto that belonged to the ranch's string of working animals. He helped her onto the pinto without being asked and without making a production of it. She settled into the saddle and adjusted her bundle across her lap, and they rode out of Red Hollow in silence, heading east, toward the place where the land opened up and the sky seemed slightly larger. Clara did not speak for the first mile. She was watching the town shrink behind her, the sagging storefronts, the cracked earth, the people who had stood and watched and said nothing. She was memorizing it the way you memorize the face of something you are determined to leave behind. Then she said, "You mentioned standing still once when you shouldn't have." Elias rode with his eyes on the trail ahead. "I did." "You don't have to tell me what you meant by that." "I know," he said. They rode another quarter-mile in silence. A hawk turned lazy circles in the white sky above them. The heat pressed down. "There was a man," Elias said finally. 3 years ago, over in Caldwell County. I was working a cattle drive. There was a man on the crew, a drover, who was treating one of the horse hands badly. Not just hard work, something worse." He paused. "I saw it. I didn't say anything. Told myself it wasn't my business. Told myself the drive would end and we'd go our separate ways and the whole thing would resolve itself." He was quiet for a moment. "It didn't resolve itself," he said. "The horse hand was 17 years old, His name was Edgar. Clara looked at the side of Elias Hart's face, the set of his jaw, the line of his mouth. The way a man looks when he is telling you something he has been carrying for a long time and has decided, for reasons he may not fully understand, to put down. "I'm sorry," she said. "About Edgar." "I am too," Elias said, "every day." The trail bent east, and the dead mesquite trees gave way to a stretch of scrubland where something that might have been grass was trying to come back up through the cracked earth. The air smelled of dust and cedar and distance. "What's Silver Creek Ranch like?" Clara asked. Something shifted slightly in Elias Hart's expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "Better than Red Hollow," he said. "That's a low bar." "Fair point." This time it was a smile, brief and real. "It's a good place. The Coles are decent people. Samuel knows cattle. Margaret knows everything else. They built the ranch from almost nothing 20 years ago. They'll treat you right." "And the work?" "Whatever you're able to do," he said. "Margaret needs help in the house. The ranch keeps records that need keeping. There are 5 children belonging to various ranch hands who nobody's properly teaching because there's no school within riding distance." He glanced at her. "You said you could read." "I can," Clara said, "and write. My father was a school teacher before he decided to become a farmer." She said the last words without bitterness, or tried to. "He taught me everything he knew, mathematics, literature, a bit of Latin, though that might not be useful." "You never know," Elias said. "No," Clara agreed quietly. "You never do." They arrived at Silver Creek Ranch in the late afternoon, when the light had finally lost its cruelty and turned golden and horizontal, cutting across the land in long, warm bands that made even the dry grass look like something worth keeping. The ranch spread across a wide valley. Not lush, not in this drought, but substantial and solid. A main house of white-painted wood and stone. Bunkhouses. A barn with a sound roof. Corrals. A kitchen garden that was being kept alive by hand, bucket by bucket, by people who refused to give up. Margaret Cole met them in the yard. She was in her mid-50s, a compact, sharp-eyed woman with silver hair pulled back and an apron that bore the evidence of a busy afternoon. She had the face of someone who had seen a great deal and processed it all without drama, and she looked at Clara for exactly the length of time it took to understand the important things. "You must be Clara," she said. "Elias sent word ahead." She looked at the bundle Clara was carrying. "Is that everything you have?" "Yes, ma'am." Margaret's expression did not show pity. Clara had been pitied enough by enough people in Red Hollow that she had learned to recognize and resent the particular softness of it. What Margaret Cole's expression showed was something more useful, assessment, and something that might become respect. "Well," Margaret said, "we'll start with supper, and then I'll show you your room. Tomorrow we can talk about what needs doing." She turned and walked back toward the house, and it was understood that Clara should follow, and that following was not submission, but simply the beginning of belonging to something that might turn out to be worth belonging to. Clara followed. At the edge of the porch, she stopped and turned back. Elias was still in the yard, unsaddling the horses. He hadn't been watching her, or if he had, he'd stopped watching by the time she turned. He was focused on the buckles and straps, his hat brim angled down, moving with the quiet competence of a man who had nothing to prove. She watched him for just a moment. Then she turned and went inside. Her room was small and clean, a narrow bed, a washstand with a porcelain basin, a window that faced east and had actual glass in it. There was a hook on the wall for her things and a braided rug on the plank floor. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted. She set her canvas bundle on the bed and took out her books. She arranged them on the windowsill, the Shakespeare, the poetry, Jane Eyre, and the other one. She set her mother's hairbrush next to them. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window. Outside, the sky was going from gold to purple to the first pale stars. The ranch sounds came through the glass, cattle settling, men's voices low in the distance, a horse blowing through its nose in the corral. The ordinary sounds of a place that was still going, still working, still alive. Clara Whitfield had been sold by desperation that morning and saved by a stranger's conscience. She did not know, sitting in that small room on that first evening, what would come next. She did not know about the drought getting worse before it got better, or about the school she would build out of nothing but determination and borrowed lumber, or about the kind of love that arrives sideways, when you're not looking for it, in the form of a man who keeps his word and carries his regrets like ballast against the temptation to be something smaller than he is. She knew only what she could see: a window full of stars, a shelf of books, and somewhere outside this door, a ranch that was still standing. She reached up and unpinned her hair and let it fall around her shoulders. And for the first time since March, since the dirt on her father's grave, since the first letter she wrote that no one answered, since the morning they walked her into the street and tried to put a price on her, Clara Whitfield allowed herself to feel something that was not fear. It was small and uncertain, like the first green thing coming up through drought-cracked earth. It didn't have a name yet, but it was alive. And she intended to keep it that way. She woke before dawn on her first morning at Silver Creek Ranch. It wasn't anxiety that pulled her from sleep. Or not only that, it was habit. 8 months of hard living had recalibrated her body's clock to something earlier and more vigilant than she'd been raised to. In Missouri, her father had let her sleep until the light came through the curtains. In Red Hollow, sleeping past first light meant losing ground you couldn't afford to lose. She lay still for a moment in the narrow bed and listened to the ranch wake up around her. Footsteps on the porch. The distant rhythmic sound of someone working the pump at the well. A rooster that had apparently not gotten the message that the drought had made optimism unreasonable. She heard Margaret Cole's voice somewhere in the direction of the kitchen. Not the words, just the cadence, firm and unhurried. The voice of a woman who had been running this place before the sun got up for 20 years and saw no reason to change the arrangement. Clara got up, washed her face in the porcelain basin, pinned her hair, and put on the gray dress. She looked at herself in the small square of mirror above the washstand. A thin face, dark eyes that had gotten older faster than the rest of her. A jawline that her mother used to call stubborn and her father used to call determined, depending on the situation. She went to find the kitchen. Margaret was at the stove, and she handed Clara a cup of coffee before she'd crossed the threshold, the way you hand a tool to someone who you've already decided is capable of using it. "Can you cook?" Margaret asked. "Well enough," Clara said. "My father wasn't particular," which was fortunate. "Men rarely are, until they are," Margaret said, which was not exactly an answer but contained several truths. "Samuel will want eggs. The hands eat in the bunkhouse. Rosa handles that. Your job this morning is the main house." She moved the skillet from one burner to another with the confident efficiency of a woman who had stopped measuring anything years ago because she knew. "After breakfast, we'll talk about the ledger. Elias says you can keep books." "I can." "Good. Because the man I had keeping them before developed a sudden interest in California and left his work in a state I'd be charitable in calling incomplete." Clara almost smiled. "How incomplete?" 3 months of entries written in a hand I can barely read, 2 columns that don't balance, and a note on the last page that says, "Close enough." Margaret's expression conveyed everything she thought of that philosophy. "Nothing I can't fix," Clara said. Margaret looked at her for a moment over the rim of her own coffee cup. The same assessing look she'd given her in the yard the evening before, but longer this time, as if the initial appraisal had been provisional, and this was the confirmation. Then she gave a single, definitive nod. "No," Margaret said. "I don't expect there is." That was the beginning. Clara had expected to feel like a charity case. She had braced for the particular discomfort of being helped, the weight of it, the obligation, the way people's generosity can sometimes feel more like a leash than a gift. But Margaret Cole ran a household the way Elias Hart ran a ranch, practically, without sentiment, with a clear understanding that work was the best currency between people who respected each other. By the end of the first week, Clara had the ledger balanced and 3 months of back entries corrected and recopied in a hand that Margaret declared legible without being asked for her opinion. She had learned the names of the 22 people who worked or lived at Silver Creek Ranch, including Rosa Medina, who ran the bunkhouse kitchen and whose tamales were, in Clara's honest assessment, the finest things she had eaten in her adult life. She had met Samuel Cole, a quiet, weathered man in his 60s, who communicated mostly in short declarative sentences and occasional appreciative silences that somehow conveyed more warmth than other men managed with paragraphs. And she had begun, cautiously, to understand the shape of Elias Hart. He was not easy to know. He wasn't cold. Coldness would have been simpler. He was present in a way that most people weren't, attentive without being intrusive, and he had a quality of stillness about him that Clara had initially misread as distance. But distance implied absence, and Elias was never absent. He noticed things. He remembered things. He showed up, not dramatically, not in ways that called attention to themselves, but consistently, in the way that water finds its level. 3 days after her arrival, she had been struggling with a stuck window in the office where she worked on the ledgers, the kind of stuck that suggests the frame has warped beyond reasoning with. She'd been fighting it for 10 minutes, quietly, because she didn't want to ask for help with something so minor. She turned around to find Elias in the doorway, having apparently materialized from nowhere, watching her with a neutral expression that contained, she thought, the faint suggestion of amusement. "The frame's warped," he said. "You have to lift and push simultaneously." "I know how windows work," she said. "I know you do," he said agreeably. He walked to the window, lifted and pushed in one motion, and it opened. He walked back to the door. "Also," he said without looking back, "the left side of that desk has a loose leg. Don't lean on it." He was gone before she could respond. She leaned on the left side of the desk. Approximately 2 hours later, she had been focused on the ledger, and grabbed it before it went over and spent the next minute holding it together and thinking about how thoroughly she deserved that. She did not tell Elias. He never mentioned it. She was fairly certain he knew. It went on like that. The ordinary rhythm of a working ranch, the days structured by necessity and repetition, the slow accumulation of small interactions that began to feel, cautiously, like a kind of life. But underneath all of it ran the drought like a dark current, constant and worsening, and no amount of routine could fully obscure what it was doing to the land and to the people on it. The water situation at Silver Creek was better than most. The creek itself was down to a thin thread, but the main well was still producing, and Samuel had been careful with their reserves in a way that Silas Dodd's debtors 40 miles west had not. But the grazing land was failing. The cattle were losing weight. 2 neighboring ranches had already sold off half their herds, and one had folded entirely, the family loading up and heading to relatives in San Antonio. Samuel Cole sat at his table every evening with maps and tallies and a face that showed nothing, which was, Claire had learned, how Samuel Cole showed worry. She heard the full weight of it one evening when she stayed late in the office working on a supply ledger, and Samuel and Margaret thought she'd already gone to her room. "We can lose another month," Samuel said. "Maybe 6 weeks. If the creek doesn't come back, we start selling." "We're not selling," Margaret said. Her voice was flat and absolute. "Margaret, we built this place. We are not going to be the ones who walk away from it." A silence. Then Samuel's voice, lower. "I'm not talking about walking away. I'm talking about staying alive long enough to have something to come back to." Clara sat very still at the desk, not breathing loudly, staring at the columns of numbers in front of her that suddenly felt very thin and inadequate against the scale of what was actually at stake. She thought about that conversation for days afterward, about what it meant to build something with your hands and your years and your loyalty, and then watch the sky refuse to cooperate, about how much of any life depended on things entirely beyond your control, and how the only answer to that, the only real answer, was to control the things you could, as well as you possibly could, for as long as you were able. She worked harder. She reorganized the supply record so that Samuel could see exactly how much they had, how fast they were using it, and what decisions would need to be made at what intervals. She cross-referenced with the cattle tallies and produced a document she left on Samuel's desk one morning without comment. A simple, clear projection of their resources against their consumption, with suggested adjustments that might buy them 2 to 3 additional weeks of margin. Samuel found her in the office that afternoon. He stood in the doorway with the document in his hand and looked at it, and then looked at her. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. "My father taught me bookkeeping," she said, "and I think clearly when there's a problem with numbers attached to it. Problems with numbers have solutions. I find that easier than problems that don't." Samuel Cole looked at her for a moment in a way that reminded her, with a sudden sharpness, of her father, the specific expression of a man who has just realized something is better than he expected. He said, which from Samuel was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. He folded the document carefully and put it in his shirt pocket and walked away. That evening at supper, he told Margaret that Clara had a head for logistics that would be wasted on ledger keeping alone. Margaret responded that she had known that since Tuesday. They spoke about it as if Clara wasn't sitting at the same table, which she had already learned to accept as the Cole family's particular form of compliment. Elias, across the table, caught her eye for just a moment. He raised his coffee cup very slightly, a gesture so small it might not have been a gesture at all. She looked back at her plate, but something in her chest did a thing she hadn't planned for. The children came into her life through Margaret's kitchen door on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after her arrival. There were 5 of them. Tomas, 11, the eldest son of the ranch's head wrangler, a serious boy who had taught himself to read from a seed catalog and thought this was probably as far as reading went. His younger sister Imelda, 9, who had a memory like a steel trap and a temper to match. Bobby Cutter, no relation to Dodd's man, she'd confirmed with relief. 7 years old, gap-toothed, possessed of the particular energy of a child who has been outdoors for most of his life and has not yet been asked to sit still. And the Brower twins, a boy and girl of 8 named Hans and Frida, the grandchildren of Helga Braun, the blacksmith's wife, brought to the ranch for reasons Clara didn't fully know yet, but suspected involved the drought making things hard in town. They appeared at the kitchen door because Margaret had told their parents that Clara would be giving lessons in the mornings, starting today, and their parents had sent them without a great deal of preparation because what child was ever fully prepared for school? Clara looked at the 5 of them standing in a row in the kitchen doorway. A variety of heights, a collective expression somewhere between suspicion and curiosity, and felt something shift in her chest that was partly terror and partly something else entirely. "Good morning," she said. 4 of them said good morning back. Bobby said nothing, because he was examining the skillet on the stove with a level of focus that suggested he was considering its engineering. "Bobby," said Imelda. "Good morning," said Bobby, without turning around. Clara had no proper classroom. She had the kitchen table and a back porch with a slant of shade in the mornings and a piece of board she could write on in charcoal. She had her 4 books and a good memory for everything her father had taught her. She had 22 years of being somebody's student to draw from, and the specific knowledge of what it felt like to have a teacher who made you feel capable rather than insufficient. She started with what they already knew. Tomas could read, slowly. Imelda could do her numbers. Bobby knew things about horses that Clara found genuinely impressive and used as a bridge. If a horse eats 14 pounds of feed a day and you have 40 horses, how much feed do you need for a week? Bobby had the answer before she finished the question. He was just working in his head, she realized. Nobody had ever given him a formal framework for what he was already doing. By the end of the first morning, she had a rough map of what each of them knew and didn't know, what they were interested in, and where they could be led if she was careful about the route. By the end of the first week, she had a routine. By the end of the second, she was cautious about using the word, even to herself, a classroom. Elias watched it happen from the periphery, the way he watched most things. She would see him sometimes when she was teaching on the back porch, moving through the yard with some piece of ranch business, slowing slightly as he passed, not enough to be obvious about it. Once she caught him standing at the corner of the barn with his arms folded, watching Tomas read aloud from the Shakespeare with the particular concentration of a boy who had decided he was going to understand this thing or die trying. Elias stood there for almost a full minute before he moved on. She didn't comment on it, neither did he. But one evening, after supper, when the light was going amber and long and the children had all gone home and the ranch was settling into its evening sounds, she found him sitting on the fence rail by the main corral, doing nothing in particular, which was something she had almost never seen him do. She leaned on the fence beside him, not close, just nearby. "Tomas is very bright," she said, after a moment. Elias nodded. "His father knows it, doesn't know what to do with it." "His father doesn't need to do anything with it," Clara said. "That's what school is for." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Where'd you learn to teach like that?" "I learned to teach like that from my father," she said, "who was the best teacher I've ever seen and who spent the last year of his life trying to grow wheat in rock." She said it plainly, without asking for anything from him. No sympathy, no softening, just the facts, laid down like stones in a path. "He had gifts he spent in the wrong direction. I don't intend to make the same mistake." Elias looked at her then, Not the brief functional glances he used in daily operations, but something longer, something that felt like genuine attention, the kind of looking that meant he was actually trying to understand what he was seeing. "What is the right direction?" he asked. Clara looked at the corral, at the cattle standing quiet in the evening heat, at the thin line of the creek catching the last light on the horizon. "Something that stays," she said. "Something that doesn't depend on rain." A long silence settled between them, the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't require filling. "That was a hard morning," Elias said quietly, "in Red Hollow." "Yes," she said. "I was sorry I didn't get there sooner." "You got there," she said. "That's not nothing." She paused. "Most people didn't." He turned back to look at the corral. Something in the line of his shoulders changed. Not relaxed exactly, but something like it. "I've been thinking about what you asked me," he said, "on the ride here, about Edgar." She waited. She had learned in 3 weeks that Elias Hart said things when he was ready to say them and not before, and that pushing produced nothing but a longer silence. "His full name was Edgar Moss," Elias said. "He was from East Texas. He used to hum to himself when he worked. Hymns, mostly, old ones, the kind you half know the words to. He had a way with horses that it was something to see." He stopped. "When I left that drive, I told myself it wasn't my fault. Told myself I hadn't done anything." He was quiet for a moment. "But not doing anything is also a choice. I've thought about that a lot since." "It is," Clara said, "and so is doing something." He looked at her again. "You made a different choice this time," she said. "You came back from whatever that cost you, and you made a different choice. That's all any of us can do." She paused. "I'd say it mattered." "You'd be a biased witness," he said, and there was something almost dry in it, almost like the edge of humor. "Probably," she agreed. The stars were coming out in the east. The first ones, the brightest ones, the ones that don't need dark to appear. Clara watched them for a moment and then said, "I'm going to build a real school." Elias didn't ask what she meant. He understood that she wasn't speaking fancifully. "You'll need lumber," he said, "and a stove, and someone to frame it properly." "I know," she said. "I don't have those things yet." "Not yet," he agreed. She pushed off from the fence rail. "Good night, Elias." "Good night, Clara." She walked back toward the main house, across the yard in the warm dark, and she felt the night air on her face, and the ground solid beneath her feet, and something building in her chest that wasn't quite confidence yet, but was the raw material of it. The stubbornness dressed up as a vision, the refusal to be only what had happened to her. Behind her, Elias Hart sat on the fence rail for a while longer, watching the stars fill in, thinking thoughts he hadn't yet figured out how to organize into language. He stayed there until the ranch went quiet and the coyotes started up somewhere in the dark hills to the north, and then he climbed down and went to check on the horses, because that was what he did. Because some forms of care are easier when they don't require words. The drought went on. In August, the creek at Silver Creek Ranch finally stopped running entirely, reduced first to a series of still pools, then to damp sand, then to nothing. Samuel Cole called a meeting of the ranch hands, standing in the yard with his hat in his hand and the dry creek bed visible behind him like an argument, and told them plainly where things stood. They could stay and work reduced wages, because the ranch was going to cut expenses everywhere it could. Or they could leave without shame, and he would give them what he owed them, and a reference that would get them work elsewhere. 7 of the 22 chose to leave. Not from disloyalty. 3 of them embraced Samuel before they went, and 2 of them shook his hand and said they intended to come back when the rain came. They were men with families and obligations and a margin that didn't allow for uncertainty. You couldn't blame a man for that. The 15 who stayed did so for different reasons. Rosa Medina had nowhere else she considered home. The Brower twins' parents had already lost their business in town. Tomas's father, a leathery wrangler named Carlos, said simply, "I started here. I'll stay here." And Elias Hart, who had enough of a reputation to walk into any ranch in 3 counties and name his terms, stayed because Silver Creek Ranch was where he was, and where he was where the work needed doing. Clara stayed because she had nowhere else she wanted to be. She worked through the heat of August, doing 3 people's jobs without complaint, and without the expectation of thanks, because complaint was a luxury, and thanks was pleasant but not load-bearing. She helped Rosa stretch supplies in ways that Rosa, for all her cooking genius, had never quite had to think about before. She sat with Margaret on evenings when the weight of uncertainty became too much for a practical woman to carry alone, and she said very little and was present with a steadiness that Margaret would later describe to Samuel as remarkable in someone so young. And every morning she taught school on the back porch. The children kept coming. Bobby, who had initially treated the lessons with the wariness of a wild thing being gentled, had become, there was no other word for it, ravenous. He read everything she gave him and came back asking for more. He had moved from seed catalogs to Shakespeare with an attitude of someone discovering that the world was substantially larger than previously advertised, and he had opinions about this. Tomas had started writing, real writing, not copying, his own words, about the ranch and the drought and what he observed about animals and weather in a hand that was improving week by week. Imelda had discovered mathematics with the focused ferocity of someone who recognizes a tool that fits their particular kind of mind. One morning, near the end of August, Elias brought lumber. He didn't announce it. He arrived in the yard with a wagon loaded with planks and said, to no one in particular, that there was wood if anyone wanted to build something, and that he'd gotten it from the mill in Abilene in exchange for some labor he'd done on a fence project last month. Clara came out of the house and looked at the wagon and looked at him. You bartered your own labor, she said. It was labor I would have given anyway, he said, studying a plank with the focused attention of a man examining absolutely anything other than her face. The mill had no use for fence work, so we traded. She looked at the lumber. How much is here? Enough for one room, he said. Small, maybe 14 by 16. Good framing wood. Clara did the math in her head. 14 by 16. 25 children, if the families within riding distance all sent theirs. It would be tight. It would be fine. I'll need a stove, she said. I know, he said. I'm working on it. She looked at him then, really looked, the way she'd been careful not to look too often or too directly, because she'd learned that looking at Elias Hart too directly was like looking at something bright. It left a mark. Why are you doing this? She asked. Not the same question she'd asked on the street in Red Hollow. A different question. A more specific one. He put the plank down. He looked at her steadily, without the deflection she might have expected. Because it matters, he said, and because you're the one making it matter. A pause. That's 2 reasons. Clara held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she said, I'll need help with the framing. I know how to frame a building, Elias said. I didn't say you didn't, she said, and went back inside, and if she was smiling as she crossed the kitchen, she was careful to have it finished before she reached the hallway. The framing started the following Saturday, the first day in 6 weeks when the temperature fell below 100 degrees by mid-morning. Elias worked and Clara worked beside him, and Carlos brought his son Tomas, who turned out to have a natural aptitude for square corners that delighted him enormously. And Samuel Cole appeared at noon with a thermos of coffee and stood watching for a while with his hands in his pockets, in the way of a man who is satisfied with something but isn't going to make a fuss about it. By sundown, the bones of the school were standing. They were rough bones, not pretty, not finished, just a frame and a floor and the promise of walls. But Clara stood at the edge of the yard in the last light and looked at the shape of it against the darkening sky, this simple rectangle of wood that meant something so far beyond its materials. And she felt in her chest the specific ache of something being built that cannot be taken back. Elias came to stand beside her, wiping sawdust from his hands with a cloth. It'll need another 2 Saturdays, he said. Maybe 3. I know, she said. I'm not impatient. He was quiet for a moment. You're the most patient person I've ever met, he said, and also the most stubborn. I'm not sure how those coexist. They're the same thing, Clara said. Patience is just stubbornness aimed at the future. She felt him look at her, felt it without looking back, the way you feel heat from something close without touching it. Clara, he said. Elias, she said, a long silence. The kind that is not absence, but presence. 2 people in the same quiet, aware of everything that is being left unsaid, and aware also that there is a right time for saying it, and that this particular evening, with sawdust in her hair and a half-built school behind them, and the drought still crouching on the land like a thing waiting to be beaten, is not quite that time. Good work today, he said finally. You too, she said, They stood together in the dimming light until the stars came out, and neither of them moved to go inside, and neither of them spoke again. And the dry wind came across the valley and moved through the frame of the new school with a sound like breathing, like something being born. The school was finished on the third Saturday of September, just as Elias had predicted. It was not large. It was not fine. The walls were rough-sawn pine that would need a second coat of whitewash come spring, and the single window on the south wall let in a draft when the wind came from that direction, which in September it frequently did. The stove Elias had been working on turned out to be a cast-iron box stove that a family in Abilene had left behind when they sold their property. He'd ridden out there on a Tuesday and come back with it loaded in the wagon bed, wrapped in burlap, without a great deal of explanation about how he'd arranged it. The benches were built from leftover lumber by Carlos and Tomas, who took the project so seriously that the finished product was, Clara thought, probably the sturdiest furniture in the entire county. On the morning of the opening, she arrived early to arrange the room. She set the benches in 2 rows. She put her 4 books on the narrow shelf Elias had built along the back wall. She stood the small chalkboard, an actual chalkboard, a piece of smooth slate that Margaret had produced from somewhere in the depths of the main house with the matter-of-fact air of someone who had been saving it for exactly this moment, against the front wall. She stood in the center of the room and turned slowly and looked at all of it. 14 by 16 feet of pine board and purpose. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed steadily, and did not cry, because she had promised herself she would save that for later, when no one was watching. Instead, she picked up a piece of chalk and wrote on the board in her clearest hand, "What we learn, no one can take from us." 11 children arrived that morning. She had expected 5. The word had spread, through the ranch families, through Helga Braun's connections in town, through the particular efficiency of people who have been waiting for something without knowing they were waiting. 3 children walked 2 miles from a neighboring farm, led by their older sister who was 14, and who stood in the doorway with her hand on the youngest one's shoulder, and said, "Is there room?" "There is always room," Clara said. She taught that first morning until nearly noon, and when it was over and the children had gone, and the room was quiet again, she sat on one of Carlos's rock-solid benches and let the feeling she'd been holding at arm's length all morning come the rest of the way in. She was still sitting there when Elias appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame with his arms crossed and looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them had any particular expression on their faces. Or rather, they both had the expression of people who have agreed without discussing it, to be honest. 11 children, she said. "I heard," he said. "I only planned for 5. "You'll need more benches," he said. "Carlos is going to be insufferably pleased about that." "He already is," Elias said. "He was in the yard when they came in. I thought he was going to shake hands with all of them." Clara laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than the chest. It surprised her, the way real laughter sometimes does, as if it had been waiting for a moment worth the trouble. She pressed her hand briefly over her mouth, and when she looked up, Elias was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something open. Something that hadn't been there when she met him, or if it had been covered over by layers of purpose and restraint. He looked away before she could examine it too closely. "There's dinner," he said. "Margaret made something. She says it's not a celebration, it's just dinner." "Which means it's a celebration," Clara said, standing. "That's been my experience," he said. They walked back to the main house side by side, close enough that their arms nearly touched in the narrow path between the garden beds, and neither of them adjusted the distance, and neither of them mentioned it, and the afternoon light came down gold and long across the dry ranch land and made everything look, briefly, like something that was going to be all right. What Clara had not expected, what no amount of planning or clear-headed practicality had prepared her for, was the specific gravity of falling in love with a man like Elias Hart. It didn't happen in a moment. It wasn't a single evening or a particular conversation or the way he looked when he was concentrating on something. Though all of those things were factors, if she was being honest. And she had gotten very good at being honest with herself because dishonesty was a luxury she'd had to give up along with a great many other things in Red Hollow. It happened the way the school happened, one board at a time, one day at a time, until one morning she woke up and the structure was simply standing there, complete, and the question was no longer whether it existed but what to do about it. What made it complicated What made it feel like standing at the edge of a high place and looking down was this. She had been sold, not metaphorically, not in the soft language that people sometimes use about exploitation or hardship. She had been stood in a street with her wrists tied and had a price called over her head while a crowd of people decided whether she was worth a sack of grain. And the man now standing at the center of her feelings was the man who had stepped forward and made them untie her hands. That history was real. It didn't vanish because she had rebuilt herself on the other side of it. And it created a question she couldn't stop turning over. How do you trust a man with your heart when you know, from experience, how quickly and completely control can be dressed up as care? She watched him with this question quietly behind her eyes, watching for the thing she'd learned to watch for. The moment when helpfulness shades into ownership, when attention becomes surveillance, when a person who helped you starts to act as though the helping entitles them to something. It never came. Elias Hart moved through the world with a specific quality of restraint that she came to understand over months was not distance or coldness, but a deliberate refusal to take up more space than was his. He gave instructions to the ranch hands with the same direct plainness he used with Samuel Cole. He did not speak over people. He did not make decisions that were not his to make. When Clara started building the school curriculum without asking anyone's permission, simply doing it because it needed doing and she was the one with the means, he said nothing except that he'd found a box of old almanacs at the Abilene Mill and thought she might be able to use them in lessons. She could. She did. And the terrible, beautiful thing was that none of it was performed. She had grown up enough and been hurt enough to know the difference between a man who was kind because he was calculating and a man who was kind because that was simply what he was. Elias Hart had built himself over 34 years and at some considerable personal cost into someone who could be trusted. She could see the cost of it in the way he carried Edgar Moss like a stone in his pocket, always there, weighing him toward the ground, keeping him honest. She loved him for the weight he carried. She loved him for the way he carried it. She was furious at herself for how much she loved him, because love was the one thing she had not budgeted for, and she had been so careful about her budgets. The complication arrived in October, in the form of a man named Gerald Holt. Holt was a land speculator from San Antonio, a tall, mustached man of 40 with the easy confidence of someone who has never had reason to question his own welcome. He arrived at Silver Creek Ranch on a Monday morning with a letter of introduction from a business associate of Samuel's and a proposition that he laid out over dinner with the smooth efficiency of someone who had given the same speech in a dozen dining rooms and had it down to an art. The drought, he said, was going to break some ranches. That was simple fact. And when it did, the land would be available. He was putting together a consortium, Eastern investors, men with capital, to acquire the failing properties and consolidate them into a larger operation. He wanted Silver Creek Ranch as the centerpiece. He was prepared to offer Samuel Cole a very favorable buyout. Samuel and Margaret could retire comfortably. The hands would be retained, most of them, the essential ones. The school would continue, perhaps. He looked at Clara when he said perhaps, and his look was the particular kind of looking that a man does when he is assessing something's usefulness. Clara kept her expression completely neutral and cut her meat. Samuel listened to all of it with the focused attention of a man who has learned that the best response to a sales pitch is to let it finish entirely before you begin dismantling it. Then he set down his fork and said, with perfect politeness, "Thank you, Gerald. I'll think on it." Holt stayed 3 days. He was charming at dinner and thorough in his inspections, and never said anything that was outright offensive, which was, Clara reflected, its own kind of skill. On his second day, he found her teaching school and stood in the doorway for a few minutes watching. The children bent over their slates, her voice moving through multiplication, Tomas translating the problems into Spanish for the Medina children in a whisper that was more helpful than disruptive. When she dismissed the children for their mid-morning break, Holt stepped inside. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "impressive operation for such limited resources." "Thank you," she said, and began cleaning the chalkboard. "I understand you've been at Silver Creek since the summer." "I have." "I understand your situation when you arrived was difficult." She set the erasing cloth down and turned to face him. "I'm not sure what you mean by my situation, Mr. Holt, but I'm sure you'll tell me." He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. I only mean that the Coles have been generous. The Coles have been fair, she said, which is different. Generosity implies charity. I work for everything I have here. Of course, he said, recovering. I meant no slight. I'm only curious, what is your stake in this school? In this ranch? Clara looked at him steadily. My stake, she said, is that 11 children come here every morning and leave knowing more than when they arrived. That's sufficient. And if the ranch changes hands, if circumstances change, then I'll build another school somewhere else, she said. That's what you do with things worth doing. Holt looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. Then he nodded once and left. She turned back to the chalkboard and stood there for a moment with her hand flat against the slate, breathing steadily, and then she picked up the chalk and wrote the next set of problems and waited for the children to come back in. That evening she told Elias about the conversation. They were in their usual positions, she leaning on the fence rail by the corral, him sitting on it, both of them facing the direction of what should have been the creek and was now just a dry scar through the grass. He's right that things might change, Elias said. He was being honest, which she always wanted even when she didn't enjoy it. I know, she said. Samuel won't sell, but the drought. He stopped. It's been 53 days since the creek ran. I know, she said again. If we go into winter dry... Elias, she said. He stopped. I know what the drought means. I've been keeping the supply ledger. I know what it means better than most people on this ranch. She looked at the dry creek bed. I'm not asking you to tell me it's going to be fine. I'm asking you to... She stopped, realizing she wasn't sure what she was asking. Elias looked at her. You're asking me to still be here, he said, when it gets harder. The accuracy of it landed somewhere in her chest. She looked at him and found that his gaze was already on her, steadily, the way he looked at things he had thought carefully about. Yes, she said. I suppose I am. I'm not going anywhere, Clara. He said it the way he said most true things, plainly, without decoration, as if ornamentation would only obscure what the words already carried on their own. She held them in the silence between them and felt their weight, which was considerable. Gerald Holt looked at me like I was furniture, she said, after a moment. Something included in the sale. I noticed, Elias said. Something shifted in his expression, a tightening at the jaw, quickly controlled. You were watching. I'm always watching the yard when strangers are on the property, he said. Habit? She said, in a tone that indicated she was aware this was a partial answer. A beat of silence. I didn't like the way he looked at you, Elias said. No, she agreed. Neither did I. Another silence, this one with a different quality. Denser, freighted with things that had been accumulating for months, like water behind a dam. Clara was aware of it. She suspected Elias was aware of it. They were both, in their different ways, people who had learned the cost of moving too fast toward something fragile. She was not ready. She knew she was not ready, not fully, not yet. There was still a part of her that was standing in a street in Red Hollow with her wrists tied, still learning, day by patient day, that the world contained things other than that. You don't unlearn humiliation the way you unlearn a wrong answer on a slate. It lives in the body. It lives in the particular flinch when someone reaches toward you without warning, in the habit of reading exits, in the way trust has to be built from scratch every single time. But she was closer than she'd been. She was closer than she'd thought possible, back in that shack in Red Hollow, looking out a glassless window at a dead field and wondering if she would spend the rest of her life being nothing but the sum of what had happened to her. Holt left on Wednesday morning with his good suit and his Eastern investors and his consortium, and Samuel Cole shook his hand at the gate and thanked him for coming in, the tone of a man who has decided something firmly and has too much dignity to make it a confrontation. Margaret watched from the porch with her arms folded and the expression of a woman whose house had been slightly soiled by a visitor and was already planning to clean it. When the wagon was out of sight, Samuel turned to Elias. Build her a proper schoolhouse next spring, he said. Bigger, with 2 windows. Yes, sir, Elias said. Samuel went back to work. That was all. That was everything. The first freeze came in late October, a sharp and clarifying cold that arrived overnight and left the ranch glittering and strange in the morning, frost on the fence rails and the dead grass and the dry creek bed. everything coated in that brief white that means the land is not as dead as it looks, just resting, just waiting. Clara walked out early, before the children arrived, before the ranch was fully awake, and stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the frozen landscape and felt something in her that corresponded to it, something that had been in a drought of its own, slowly finding its way back. Elias found her there. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the frost, too. "First one of the season," he said. "It's beautiful," she said. "Terrible, but beautiful." "Most things are," he said. She turned to look at him. The morning light was thin and white and fell across his face without flattery, the way winter light does, so showing everything clearly, all the weathering and the honesty and the lines around his eyes that came from years of looking at hard horizons. She looked at him for a moment longer than she intended. He looked back. "Elias," she said, and then, before the careful part of her could calculate the risk and advise against it, "I need to say something." He was very still. I know there are reasons to be careful," she said, "and I have been careful. I have been so careful you could probably measure it." She pressed her hands against her coat, a steadying gesture. "But I think carefully doesn't mean never. I think carefully means knowing what you're doing and doing it anyway, with your eyes open." "Clara," he started. "I'm not finished," she said. Not sharply, gently. The firmness of someone who has organized their courage and doesn't want to lose their place. "I know you feel something. I'm not imagining it. I know I'm not imagining it because I've spent 4 months watching you the way you watch things, carefully, honestly, without making assumptions. And what I see is—" She stopped, found the words. "What I see is a man who thinks he has to stay behind everyone else because of what happened in Caldwell County, who thinks that standing in front of something means controlling it, and so he stays back. And I want you to know that I know the difference between a man who stands in front of something to possess it and a man who stands in front of it to protect it." She met his eyes. "I know which one you are." The silence that followed was the longest she had ever shared with him. The frost glittered. Somewhere in the corral a horse moved. A hawk crossed the white sky without a sound. And then Elias Hart, who chose his words the way other men chose weapons, carefully, deliberately, only when necessary, said, "I have loved you since the day you told me patience and stubbornness were the same thing." Clara Whitfield, who had been sold for the price of a sack of grain and had rebuilt herself board by board into something nobody could price again, felt the words land in the center of her chest and stay there, warm and immovable, like an ember in a cold stove. "That was months ago," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been careful." "Too careful," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "too careful." He crossed the distance between them. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the same deliberate certainty he brought to everything that mattered, and took her hand in both of his, the rough warmth of them familiar and entirely new at the same time. He looked down at her wrist, where the rope scar had faded to a faint line, and he brought it up and pressed his mouth to it, briefly, with a reverence that had nothing performative about it. Just a man acknowledging a mark, a history, a line between what was and what is. She stood in the frost with her hand in his and looked at him and felt something she had not expected to feel again. Not the cautious, rationed something of the past months, but the full, unguarded version of it. The kind that doesn't ask permission. The kind that knows its own name. "We are very complicated people," she said quietly. "We are," he agreed. "This is going to take some working out. Most things worth doing do," he said. And there was the echo of her own words from weeks ago, returned to her in his voice, which was exactly the kind of thing Elias Hart did. Held on to what mattered and gave it back when the time was right. She did not look away. He did not look away. The frost began to melt in the thin morning sun, dripping from the fence rails in a sound like the very beginning of water finding its way back. And Clara Whitfield stood in it and felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, not defined by what had been done to her, but by what she had chosen. What she was choosing still. Behind them, the school stood in the frost with its rough pine walls and its chalkboard, and its 11 sets of initials that the children had scratched into one of Carlos's benches when they thought no one was watching. It stood the way things stand when they are built by people who mean them, solidly, without apology, as if it had always been there and simply needed someone stubborn and patient enough to find it. The ranch would go on. The drought would break or it wouldn't, and they would face what came. The school would grow. There would be hard seasons ahead and good ones, and decisions that cost something and others that gave something back. And all of it would require exactly what Clara Whitfield had been forging in herself since the morning a stranger cut the rope from her wrists and asked, quietly, if he could. She stood in the first frost of October with her hand in Elias Hart's hand, and her chin up and her eyes open. She was ready. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing about two careful, complicated people finding their way toward each other is ever simple, and Clara and Elias were perhaps the most careful and complicated people in 3 counties. But there was a quality to the difficulty now that was entirely different from what had come before. See, the difficulty of building something rather than the difficulty of surviving something, which is a distinction that makes all the difference in the world. They did not make grand declarations or sudden changes. That was not who they were, either of them. What changed was smaller and more durable than declarations. The way he came to find her in the evenings without needing a reason, the way she stopped measuring the distance she kept from things that mattered to her and simply stood where she wanted to stand. They talked more, and talked differently, not just the practical, problem-adjacent conversation of 2 people working the same land, but the deeper kind, the kind that finds its way into the interior of a person and shows you who they are when they are not performing function. She told him about Missouri, about the schoolhouse where her father had taught for 15 years, the one with the cracked plaster wall that her father had patched every fall, and that cracked again every winter, and that he patched again every fall anyway, because the children needed the wall, and the crack didn't care about need. She told him about her mother's books and how she had read them so many times as a child that she could recite passages by heart. And sometimes, in the evenings, she did, sitting on the porch with the cold coming down, her voice carrying lines from Shakespeare into the dark Texas air. Elias listened in the way he did everything, completely, without the restless energy of a person waiting for their turn to speak. He told her more about his life before Silver Creek, about growing up the son of a Kentucky horse trader who loved his animals better than his children, not cruelly, but simply with a priority that became clear early. About leaving at 17 and working his way west through a sequence of ranches and cattle drives that had been his education in the world. What men were capable of, good and bad, and how quickly those 2 things could swap positions in a person if the conditions were right. About the years it had taken him to find Silver Creek and the Coles, and something that felt, for the first time, like a place worth staying. "Did you ever want more than this?" she asked him one evening. They were sitting on the porch steps of the main house, shoulder to shoulder in the cold, a blanket across their laps that Margaret had brought out without comment. The stars were brilliant in the clear November sky, the kind of stars that only appear when the air is cold and dry and entirely honest. "More than what?" he said. "Land of your own. A bigger life. Something more." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "I used to think more meant bigger," he said. "More cattle, more territory, more to show for the years." He paused. "I don't think that anymore." "What do you think now?" "I think more means deeper," he said. "You can have 1,000 acres and be standing on the surface of your own life, or you can have—" He stopped, looked at her. "This," he said simply. Clara looked at him and felt the words settle over her like the blanket. Warm, specific, entirely sufficient. November turned and the cold settled in properly. The kind of Texas winter that is not northern brutal but still serious enough to mean business. The school continued through it. Clara had anticipated that the cold would thin attendance. The walk from some of the outlying farms was long and the mornings were sharp. But the children kept coming, sometimes arriving with frost in their eyelashes and noses red from the wind. And she learned to start the cast-iron stove an hour before lessons began, so the room would be warm when they got there. The school had grown. 14 children now, then 16, then a consistent 19 by November's end. The older sister who had appeared in the doorway on the first day, her name was Pearl Hadley, had started coming herself, sitting at the back bench with her arms folded as if she was there out of obligation, staying until the last possible minute as if she was there out of hunger. Clara treated her the same way she treated Bobby, who had arrived suspicious and become ravenous. She gave her exactly what she came for and let her decide what that meant. By December, Pearl was helping with the younger children during reading. She had a firm, clear voice and no patience for nonsense, which the younger children respected enormously. Clara told her one morning, as simply as she could, that she had a gift for teaching and that gifts were wasted when they went unnamed. Pearl looked at her with the expression of someone who has been told something they already suspected and did not know they were allowed to claim. "My mother says school is forgetting the basics and then getting back to work," she said. "Your mother's not wrong about the basics," Clara said, "but work comes in more forms than people generally advertise." She handed Pearl a primer she had borrowed from Margaret's shelf. "Take that home. Teach your mother something from it next week and tell me how it goes." Pearl took the primer with the careful hands of someone accepting something breakable. The following week, she came back and said quietly that her mother had learned 3 things and that her mother had cried a little, and Pearl's voice, reporting this, was the voice of someone who has just discovered the full weight of what she is capable of. Clara put that moment in the part of herself where she kept things she intended to keep for a long time. It was during this stretch of November and December that Silas Dodd made his reappearance. Not in person, not yet, but in the form of a letter that arrived at Silver Creek Ranch addressed to Clara, in a hand she recognized on sight and felt in her stomach the way you feel a wrong step on familiar ground. She opened it alone, in the office, and read it with her face perfectly still. The letter was short. Dodd wrote that he was in possession of a new copy of the labor contract, properly recorded at the county courthouse in Abilene, and that a judge had reviewed it and found it enforceable under a statute of frontier labor obligation that predated statehood. He wrote that he had been patient. He wrote that he expected a reply within 30 days regarding arrangements for the satisfaction of the debt, the amount of which he itemized at the bottom in figures that bore no relationship to anything Clara's father had actually borrowed. He wrote that he trusted she was well and that the Coles had treated her admirably and that he bore no personal ill will. He signed it with regards, which Clara thought was the most dishonest 2 words she had read in months, that contained no actual lies. She sat with the letter for 10 minutes. She was not panicking, or rather, she was allowing the first sharp wave of it to pass through her and recede before she acted, which was the version of courage she had been practicing all year. Then she folded the letter, put it in her pocket, and went to find Elias. He was in the barn, working on a harness that had cracked along one of the traces. He looked up when she came in and read her face before she spoke. "What happened?" he said. She handed him the letter without a word. He read it standing beside the workbench, holding it in both hands, and she watched his face while he read. His expression did not change, exactly. Elias Hart's face was not a face that changed easily, but something moved through it, something she recognized as the particular temperature of a man's anger when it is entirely controlled and therefore considerably more dangerous than the uncontrolled kind. He folded the letter and held it. "This statute," he said, "I've heard of it. It was used against indentured workers in the Territory period. It's been challenged." "Successfully?" "Sometimes," he said. "Depends on the judge and the county." He looked at her. "This goes to Samuel." "I know," she said. "And to his lawyer in Abilene. Not next week. Today." "I know," she said again. "I'm not frightened of him, Elias. I want to be clear about that." He looked at her steadily. "I was frightened of him in June," she said, "when I didn't have anything. When I was standing in that street with nothing but a brown dress and 4 books and whatever was left of my dignity. I'm not that person in the same way anymore." She held his gaze. "But I am angry. And I want to handle it properly, because anger handled properly is more effective than anger handled any other way." Elias Hart looked at the woman in front of him, the woman he had watched build a school from borrowed lumber and a box stove, who had taught 19 children through a drought, who had looked a land speculator in the eye and told him her stake was not up for sale. And something in his face shifted into an expression she had not seen before, a kind of fierce, quiet pride that was entirely different from admiration. "Samuel's in the main house," he said. They went together. Samuel Cole read the letter in approximately 45 seconds. Then he set it on the table and looked at it for a moment in the manner of a man deciding the most efficient path through a problem. "Thomas Greer," he said to no one in particular. Greer was his lawyer in Abilene. "I was going to suggest the same," Elias said. "Silas Dodd is a fool," Samuel said. which was remarkable because it was the most characterizing statement Clara had ever heard him make about any person. He stood up. "I'll ride to Abilene tomorrow morning." He looked at Clara. "You have the original letter, the one your father received." "Yes," she said. "I've kept it." "Good girl," he said, which was not a phrase Clara generally appreciated, but which from Samuel Cole she had learned was the equivalent of an encomium. He picked up the letter and walked toward his study. Margaret, who had been standing in the doorway of the kitchen throughout this entire exchange, said, "Clara, come and have coffee." It was not a question. Clara followed her into the kitchen and sat at the table and wrapped both hands around the cup Margaret set in front of her and felt the warmth of it travel up through her palms. "He's a petty man," Margaret said, sitting across from her. "Petty men get one good move and they play it over and over because it worked once. This is Silas Dodd playing his one move." "Will it work?" Clara asked. She was being direct because Margaret appreciated directness. "Thomas Greer is the best lawyer between here and Dallas," Margaret said. "And Samuel Cole has known judges in 3 counties for 20 years. And you—" She looked at Clara across the table. "You have the original contract. A fraudulent document is not improved by being registered at a courthouse. It's just a fraudulent document with better filing." She picked up her own cup. "No, it won't work," Clara breathed. "All right. Are you frightened?" "I said to Elias I wasn't." "I know what you said to Elias," Margaret said, with the expression of a woman who sees everything and chooses her moments. "I'm asking what you said to yourself." A pause. "A little," Clara admitted. "Old habits." Margaret nodded. "That's honest. Hold on to the honest and let the rest go." She glanced toward the doorway, toward the direction of where Elias was, and then back at Clara with the specific look of a woman who does not say things she hasn't thought through carefully. "He's a good man," she said. "He has been waiting a long time for something worth waiting for. I want you to know that." Clara looked at her cup. "Margaret." "I'm not interfering," Margaret said briskly. "I'm informing. There's a distinction." She stood up. "Drink your coffee." Samuel rode to Abilene and spent 2 days with Thomas Greer and came back with a document of his own, a legal response that Greer had filed at the same courthouse where Dodd's contract was registered, challenging its validity on 4 separate grounds. The most significant of which was that the frontier labor statute Dodd had cited had been specifically superseded by a state labor ordinance passed in 1879, 3 years before James Whitfield had set foot in Texas. The contract was not just fraudulent, it was built on a law that no longer existed. Silas Dodd received Greer's response in early December and was not heard from again. Not at Silver Creek, not in connection with Clara, not in any form that required a response. He was, as Margaret had predicted, a man with one move. He had played it. It had not worked. Clara heard the outcome from Samuel, who told her plainly and without drama, and she nodded and said thank you and went back to the office and sat down at the ledger, and sat there for a moment without working, just sitting, feeling the specific quality of a door being closed and locked from the outside, which is entirely different from closing a door yourself. She picked up her pen and went back to work. It was the week before Christmas when the rain finally came. It announced itself properly, not a surprise but a building, the way weather sometimes gives you time to prepare. Clouds moving in from the southwest over 3 days, the air changing character, gaining weight, the smell of it shifting from the dry mineral smell of long drought to something alive and green and imminent. The ranch hands watched the sky the way they'd been watching it for months, but differently now, not with the hollow vigilance of hoping, but with the held breath intensity of believing. It started on a Wednesday night. Clara woke to the sound of it on the school's roof. She had taken to sleeping with her window cracked an inch despite the cold, because she liked the night air and because the window with glass was still a novelty she hadn't fully exhausted, and lay still for a moment listening. Raindrops. Real ones. Not the spitting, teasing half-efforts that had mocked the county 3 times in the past 6 months and then stopped. These were the sustained, purposeful drops of rain that intends to stay. She got up and opened the window all the way and put her hand out into the dark and felt the rain hit her palm, cold and definitive, and she stood there with her hand in the rain for a long moment, doing something that was not prayer but was the closest she came to it. A full, silent, overwhelmed attention directed at something larger than herself. She heard the bunkhouse door open. then the main house door, then voices, low and astonished, building into something louder. Rosa laughing, Carlos shouting something in Spanish that Clara's growing vocabulary translated as "it's raining, it's actually raining." And through the window she could see lantern light moving in the yard, people coming out in the rain without coats and not caring, looking up. She put on her coat and went outside. The yard was full. Everyone who lived or worked at Silver Creek Ranch was there. Samuel in his boots and nightshirt, Margaret beside him with her silver hair loose around her shoulders, Rosa with her hands clasped, the Wranglers and the Hands, and Tomas, who had been allowed to sleep in the bunkhouse with his father on weekends, and who was standing in the rain with his face turned up and his eyes closed, and an expression Clara had never seen on his serious 11-year-old face before. Joy, pure and uncomplicated, the kind that children are capable of when adults get out of the way. Elias was at the edge of the yard near the dry creek bed. She crossed the yard to him. The rain was steady now, proper rain, soaking rain, the kind that makes the earth believe again. She came to stand beside him, and they both looked at the creek bed, where the first thin line of water was beginning to find its way along the bottom, tentative, dark, alive. "There it is," he said. "There it is," she said. They stood in the rain and watched the creek come back. After a while, she didn't know how long, time had gone soft at the edges. She felt his hand find hers in the dark, and she turned her palm to meet it, and they stood that way while the rain came down and the creek found its voice again, and the rest of the ranch celebrated around them with the particular joy of people who have waited a long time for something they were not entirely sure was coming. "I've been building something," Elias said. He was looking at the creek. "I know," she said. "The school extension, Samuel told me." "Not the school," he said. She looked at him. The rain moved through the lantern light from the yard in long silver lines. "There's a valley," he said, "about 4 miles east, up past the second ridge. I found it 3 years ago. Good water, protected from the wind, an oak grove on the north side." He paused. "I've been building on it since September." Something in her chest went very still and very attentive. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said, "until it was done. Until it was worth offering." He finally turned to look at her, and his face in the rain and the distant lantern light was entirely without defense, entirely open, the face of a man who has decided that the risk of being known is preferable to the safety of being hidden. "It's not done," he said, "but I think it's worth offering." Clara Whitfield looked at Elias Hart in the rain on the night the drought broke and felt the full weight of the year behind her. Red Hollow, and the rope, and the street, and the brown dress, and the shack, and the 4 books, and the school, and the 11 children, and the 19 children, and Pearl Hadley, and the cast-iron stove, and the frost, and the letter, and the creek coming back. All of it. Every board she had laid, everything she had chosen, every morning she had gotten up and decided not to be only what had been done to her. She felt all of it, and it didn't feel like weight anymore. "Show me," she said. He looked at her for a moment, making sure he understood. Then he nodded, once, slowly, the way he nodded when something was decided and the decision was good. "Tomorrow," he said, "when it's light." "Tomorrow," she agreed. The rain came down around them, steady and faithful, and entirely without mercy or sentiment, just water finding its way back to where it belonged, the way things do when the conditions finally allow it. Margaret Cole, watching from the porch with a shawl around her shoulders, saw the two of them standing at the edge of the creek bed, with their hands joined and the rain moving through them like they were simply part of the landscape. Two things that had found their right position relative to each other and were standing in it without apology. She went inside and put the kettle on, because there would be celebrating to do in the morning, and celebrating required coffee, and she had been waiting for this particular morning for quite some time. The creek ran all night. By dawn it was moving at the pace of something that had places to be. The rain came on a Thursday. It came the way rain comes after a long drought. Not gently, not with the tentative courtesy of a season transitioning, but all at once, like a debt being paid in full. Clara was in the schoolhouse when it started. 17 children bent over their slates in the particular concentrated silence of a room where learning is actually happening. And the first drops hit the pine roof like scattered gravel, and then more. And then the sound became a roar, a sustained, incredible roar that made every child in the room look up at once with the same expression, wide-eyed, disbelieving, the face of someone hearing a language they had almost forgotten. Bobby was the first one out of his seat. "It's raining," he announced, as though this required confirmation. "Sit down, Bobby," Clara said. "But it's—" "I know what it is," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. He lasted approximately 45 seconds. Then Tomas was up, and then Imelda, and then the Brower twins, and then 11 more in a cascade, and Clara set down her chalk and looked at the ceiling and accepted what was happening with the particular grace of a teacher who knows when the lesson has changed. "All right," she said, "outside, all of you." They poured out of the schoolhouse door and into the rain, and Clara followed them, and she stood in the yard of Silver Creek Ranch in the cold November rain, with 17 children shrieking and spinning in circles around her, and she turned her face up to the sky and let it fall on her, soaking her hair and her coat and her boots, and she felt the water on her face and the sound of it everywhere around her, and something in her chest opened like a door that had been stuck for a very long time. She heard running boots behind her and turned to find Elias crossing the yard at something faster than his usual deliberate pace, hat in hand, hair already dark with rain, looking at the sky with an expression that she had never seen on him before. Raw relief, the kind that a careful man only shows when the thing he has been quietly dreading finally resolves itself. He stopped beside her. He looked up. 58 days, he said. 58 days since anything fell. 59, she said. I've been keeping count. He looked at her. She looked at him. The rain came down between them and around them, and the children spiraled past in their orbits of delight, and Elias Hart reached over and took Clara's hand the way he had learned to take it, simply, without announcement, because it was where his hand belonged. And they stood together in the first real rain of the season and watched the dry earth begin to drink. The drought broke completely over the following 2 weeks. Not every day brought rain, but enough came, steadily, soaking down through the cracked caliche and reaching the roots of things that had been waiting in a state of suspended endurance for months. The creek came back, first as a trickle, then as a murmur. Then, after a sustained 3-day rain in late November, as the full, running thing it was meant to be, cold and clear, cutting its familiar path through the Silver Creek Valley with the easy confidence of water that knows where it's going. Samuel Cole stood at the creek bank the morning it ran full again, and said nothing for a long time. Then he crouched down, dipped his hand in, and stood back up, and went to find Margaret. And that evening at supper, he said grace in 4 words, his shortest ever, and his most sincere. The ranch came back to life with the deliberate steadiness of a place that had been managed well through the worst, and now had the foundation to rebuild. Samuel sent word to the 7 hands who had left during the drought, and 4 of them came back. 2 had found situations elsewhere and sent their respects. 1, a young man named Perkins, came back with a wife and a baby daughter, which Rosa Medina treated as a personal triumph, as though she had arranged it herself. Clara watched all of it and continued to teach, and continued to love the man who came to stand in the schoolhouse doorway sometimes when he thought she wouldn't notice, and stayed a little longer each time, and began to understand that what she had been building at Silver Creek Ranch was not a temporary stay while she figured out what came next. This was what came next. This was the thing itself. The letter from Silas Dodd arrived in December. It came addressed to Clara Care of Silver Creek Ranch, in the careful handwriting of a man who has had a document prepared by someone else. A lawyer, probably, or someone playing at being one. She recognized the envelope before she opened it, recognized the particular quality of paper that Dodd favored, thick and slightly yellowed, the paper of a man who wanted his documents to look like they had authority even when they didn't. She read it at the kitchen table, alone, with her coffee going cold beside her. The letter informed her, in the circumspect language of a man who had learned to keep his threats deniable, that the original labor contract, the one Elias had prevented him from selling in the street that July morning, had been reviewed by counsel and remained legally binding. That the debt her father had incurred had accrued additional interest. That Dodd was prepared to pursue legal remedy unless Miss Whitfield presented herself for a conversation about settlement. That he was, as always, a reasonable man. Clara folded the letter carefully along its original creases and put it in her coat pocket and went to find Elias. She found him in the barn, working on a saddle with the methodical attention he brought to any task that required his hands and let his mind run. He looked up when she came in. He read her face before she said a word. She had noticed this about him, that he read her the way she read her students, completely, quickly, without making a performance of it. "What happened?" he said. She gave him the letter. He read it standing up, holding it with both hands, and she watched his face as he read and saw the careful, controlled stillness that meant he was angry. The specific stillness of a man who has learned that anger without direction is just noise. He folded it when he was done and held it for a moment. "He's not going to stop," Clara said. "Not because he needs the money, because I got away." "Yes," Elias said. "I want to take this to a lawyer." "So do I." "I have the original contract," she said, "the one my father signed. I've had it since March. I kept it because I knew, even then, that it would matter someday." She paused. "I also have 3 letters I wrote to the county sheriff that were never answered, and I know of at least 2 other families Dodd has done similar things to. The Harmons, and a family called Weiss who left for San Antonio in August. If someone were to speak to them—" Elias was looking at her with an expression that contained, she thought, both admiration and something that was almost amusement. "You've been building a case," he said. "I've been keeping records," she said. "It seemed prudent." He handed the letter back to her. "Samuel knows a lawyer in Abilene," he said. "A real one. He's been wanting a reason to point him at Dodd's operation for years." He paused. "This is the reason." "Will Samuel—" "I'll talk to him tonight," Elias said. "He'll say yes." He looked at her steadily. "Dodd made a mistake writing that letter. He assumed you'd be frightened." "I was frightened," Clara said. "I'm still frightened. I'm doing it anyway." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know a man in Caldwell County, someone who knew Edgar Moss. He told me once that Dodd's contracts had strings to other schemes, land fraud mostly, over 3 counties. He set the saddle down. "If the Abilene lawyer wants to go further than just your contract, I want him to go as far as the evidence takes him," Clara said. Elias nodded. "Once, definitively." "Then that's what we'll tell him." Samuel Cole said yes that evening, in the way Samuel said yes to things he had already decided, a single nod, and the name of the lawyer, and then a return to whatever he had been doing before, as if the matter were already settled, which, in Samuel's experience, it now was. The lawyer's name was Price, a compact, serious man who arrived at Silver Creek Ranch in January with a briefcase and the focused energy of someone who genuinely enjoyed dismantling fraudulent contracts. Clara laid everything on the table in Samuel's study: the original contract, the letters, the names of the Harmon and Weiss families, Elias's contact in Caldwell County. Price went through it all with the systematic pleasure of a man reading a very satisfying novel. "This contract is unenforceable," he said, of Dodd's original document. "The labor clause alone violates 3 separate statutes. Your father signed it under misrepresentation of the land value. I can prove that with the deed and the county assessor's records from the same period." He looked up. "The interest calculations are fraudulent on their face." "I know," Clara said. "I'm a bookkeeper." Price looked at her with new attention. "Are you?" "I noticed the compounding method he used doesn't correspond to any legitimate financial practice I've encountered," she said. "I wrote out the correct calculations with citations from 2 accounting references, if that's helpful." Price set down his pen. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "I think you may have saved me approximately 2 weeks of work." The case, when Price filed it in February, was not just Clara's case. It was by then a case involving 4 families, 11 fraudulent contracts, and a land scheme that touched 2 counties and had been running for 6 years. Silas Dodd received the papers on a Monday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon he had hired a lawyer of his own, and by Wednesday he had offered a settlement that Price described as inadequate, and Clara described in less polite terms. "He wants to negotiate," Price told her, in the kitchen at Silver Creek Ranch, where they had taken a meeting because it was warm and Rosa made exceptional coffee. "He can negotiate with the judge," Clara said. Price's expression suggested he appreciated her position. "That's the aggressive approach. He tied my wrists," she said. "He stood me in a street. He's been running the same scheme on families with less than we have for 6 years. She met Price's eyes. "I want him to stand in front of someone who has the authority to say, 'This stops.'" Price nodded. "Then that's what we'll do." The hearing was held in Abilene in March, in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and ink, and the accumulated weight of decades of people trying to make things right. Clara sat at the plaintiff's table in the blue dress Margaret had helped her make over the winter, the finest thing she owned, and the first garment she had ever owned that was made specifically for her, to her measurements, in a color she had chosen. Elias sat behind the rail in the gallery, in his good jacket, with his hat in his hands. Silas Dodd sat at the opposite table. He had a good lawyer and a confident posture and the practiced ease of a man who had been in rooms like this before and usually come out ahead. He looked at Clara across the courtroom floor. She looked back at him. She held his gaze without flinching, without anger, with the level, clear-eyed regard of a woman who has organized her facts and trusts the structure she has built. He looked away first. The hearing lasted 2 days. Price presented the contracts, the calculations, the witnesses, a man from the Harmon family, haggard but steady. Elias's contact from Caldwell County, a county assessor who confirmed the land values at the time of sale. Clara testified for 40 minutes in a voice that did not shake, describing what had happened in Red Hollow in precise and unemotional terms that were, Price told her afterward, more effective than anything else in the proceeding. The judge was a small, sharp-faced man named Calloway, who had been on the bench for 20 years and had heard a great deal, and whose expressions during testimony were as readable as a stone wall. He asked Clara one question directly at the end of her testimony. "Miss Whitfield, the morning in question, in Red Hollow, were you afraid?" Clara considered the question for exactly as long as it deserved. "Yes," she said. "I was terrified." "But you kept your chin up," Judge Calloway said. It was not quite a question. "I didn't know what else to do," she said. It seemed important not to let him see it. The judge wrote something on his pad. He did not say anything else. The ruling came on the third day. The contracts, all 11 of them, including the one bearing James Whitfield's desperate signature, were declared void. The interest accumulated under fraudulent calculation methods was struck entirely. The land deed scheme was referred to the district attorney for criminal investigation. Silas Dodd was ordered to repay, to each affected family, a sum equivalent to the labor and property he had extracted under false pretenses. The courtroom was quiet for a moment after Calloway finished reading. Then the man from the Harmon family, sitting 2 rows behind Elias, let out a breath so long and ragged it sounded like a year leaving his body. Clara sat very still at the plaintiff's table with her hands folded in front of her and felt something settle in her chest. Not triumph exactly, not the sharp, bright thing she might have expected. Something quieter. The feeling of a door closing on something that should have closed a long time ago. And the particular relief of walking away from a room you never needed to go back to. She felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned. Elias was standing behind the rail, and he was looking at her with an expression that she had learned over these months to read completely, the one that contained everything he felt without requiring any of it to be said. She reached up and covered his hand with hers. "It's over," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." They rode back to Silver Creek Ranch in the late afternoon, the 2 of them, on the same road they had taken the first time, 9 miles east of Red Hollow, through the scrubland, under the wide Texas sky. The land looked different in March than it had in July. Green was coming back, tentative and real, through the winter grass. The creek would be running. The school would have 21 students tomorrow morning because 4 more families had enrolled their children since the rain. They rode without speaking for a while because they had learned the value of each other's quiet. The afternoon light came long and gold across everything, the way it does in Texas in early spring, making the ordinary landscape into something that deserves looking at. "I want to show you something," Elias said, after they had ridden perhaps 5 miles. He turned his horse off the main track, north, onto a trail she hadn't been on before, narrower, winding up through a rise of cedar and limestone into a fold in the land she hadn't known was there. She followed without asking, because she had learned that Elias did not lead you somewhere without a reason. The trail opened out, after 10 minutes, into a valley. Small, protected by the limestone rise on 3 sides, with a view to the south across open grassland that went on for what looked like forever. There was a live oak at the eastern edge of it, old and enormous, its arms spread like it had been there since the land was young. And beneath it, just set back enough to take advantage of the shade and the view in equal measure, was the beginning of a house, not a finished house, not even close. The foundation was laid, limestone blocks fitted together with the patient precision she recognized as Elias's work. 2 walls were framed, the raw wood still pale and new, a pile of lumber under oilcloth, the outline of rooms visible in the framing, a kitchen that faced south, a parlor with room for books, a front porch designed to catch the evening breeze. Clara pulled her horse up at the edge of the clearing and looked at it for a long time. She looked at the foundation. She looked at the live oak. She looked at the view south across the grassland in the late light. She looked at the 2 walls standing in the early spring evening, and the pile of lumber, and the care in every stone and joint. She looked at Elias. He had dismounted and was standing with his horse's reins in his hand, watching her with the expression of a man who has done something that cost him a great deal of vulnerability and is now waiting in the most honest silence of his life. "You built this," she said. "I've been building it," he said, "since November, while I was keeping the ledgers and teaching school and going to Abilene." "You were busy," he said. "Somebody had to do this." Clara dismounted. She walked across the limestone foundation, across the new wood of the floor frame, to the center of what would be the parlor. She stood there and looked at the view through the gap where the south wall would be. The grassland, the evening light, the sky going from gold to that particular shade of rose that Texas does better than anywhere else on earth. She heard his footsteps behind her. She turned. Elias Hart stood at the edge of the framing with his hat in his hands, and something on his face that she had never seen there before. Not the controlled steadiness, not the careful restraint, but something open and uncertain and entirely real. The expression of a man who has built something with everything he has and is now standing in front of the person he built it for, hoping. "I don't have a speech," he said. "You know I'm not built for speeches." "I know," she said. "I know the timing isn't—" He stopped, started again. "I wanted to wait until the court was done, until Dodd was settled, until you weren't carrying that anymore." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't want you to have any reason to think that what I'm about to ask has anything to do with anything except what it has to do with." Clara felt her heart doing something it had no business doing at this altitude. "Which is what?" she said. "Which is that I want to spend the rest of my life building things with you," he said. "This house. The school. When Samuel makes it bigger in spring. Whatever comes next. I want to do it here, in this valley, with you." He paused. "I want to give you something that's yours. Not because you needed saving. You never needed saving, Clara. You needed a fair chance and you took it and made everything yourself. I know that." His voice was even, certain, the voice of a man who has thought about this from every angle and has arrived at his answer. "I want to marry you because you are the most complete person I have ever known, and this house has your name built into every stone of it, even though I never told you that until just now." The valley was very quiet. The live oak moved in the evening breeze with a sound like a long, slow exhale. Clara Whitfield, who had stood in a street with her wrists bound and her chin up, who had balanced fraudulent ledgers and rebuilt honest ones, who had taught 17 children in a 14 by 16 room and made every one of them believe the world was larger than they'd thought, who had faced a courtroom and a swindler and her own terror and come out the other side with herself intact, looked at the man she loved and felt no uncertainty whatsoever. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." Something broke open in Elias Hart's face, not dramatically, not with the theatrical relief of a man who has been holding his breath. Just quietly, the way a room fills with light when someone opens a window. He crossed the floor frame to her and she met him halfway, and he took her face in his work-rough hands and looked at her for a moment, the way you look at something you have been afraid of losing before you have even fully had it. "I've loved you since July," he said quietly. "Since the day I cut that rope." "I know," she said. "I've known for a while. And you made me wait. You needed to come to it yourself," she said. "Same as me." He laughed then. A real one. The kind she had learned to treasure because it was not frequent and therefore never cheap. She rose on her toes and kissed him there in the unfinished parlor of the house he had built with his hands, under the live oak in the small valley that would become their place, in the evening light of a Texas spring that smelled of cedar and new grass and the return of everything that drought had briefly taken. They were married on Christmas Day, Margaret Cole organized it with the efficiency she brought to everything, quietly, thoroughly, without fuss, and with results that were, in Clara's opinion, more beautiful than any amount of fuss could have produced. The ceremony was held in the main house at Silver Creek Ranch, in the parlor that Margaret had transformed with cedar boughs and candles and a tablecloth that Clara suspected had been waiting in a chest for exactly this kind of occasion. Everyone came. Carlos and Tomas, who stood in the back in their good shirts with the matching posture of men who take their attendance at important events seriously. Rosa Medina, who cried from the moment Clara appeared in the doorway and did not stop until after dinner, and was unapologetic about it. Bobby, age 7, who had been given the responsibility of carrying the rings and treated it with the focused gravity of a surgeon, which delighted everyone. The Brower twins, scrubbed to a shine. Imelda, who had made Clara a crown of dried wildflowers with the exacting craftsmanship of a girl who does nothing by halves. Helga Braun came from Red Hollow, the one person from that town who had been kind, who had leaned over a fence and whispered a warning when there was no reason to except decency. Clara embraced her at the door and held on longer than was strictly ceremonial, and Helga patted her back with the large, capable hands of a woman who has spent her life making things with them. Samuel Cole stood beside Elias at the front of the parlor and looked, for the first and only time Clara had ever seen, slightly overcome. He recovered quickly, because he was Samuel Cole, and returned his face to its usual composed arrangement, but the evidence had been there. Clara walked into the parlor in the blue dress, the one from the courthouse, let out slightly and retrimmed by Margaret's expert hands, with her hair pinned up and her mother's hairbrush the only decoration she'd added, tucked into the arrangement, something private and present. She walked toward Elias. He was watching her come the way he watched everything that mattered, completely, honestly, without concealment. He was wearing a dark jacket she hadn't seen before. New, she realized, he had gotten it made for today, and his hair was combed and his face was the face she had been reading for months, like a language she was still learning and always found worth the study. She stopped in front of him. "You look," he started. "Don't get sentimental," she said quietly, because her composure was structural at this point, and she needed it to hold. "Clara," he said. "All right," she said. "Say it." "You look like yourself," he said, "which is the finest thing I can think of to say." She pressed her lips together against the thing happening in her chest. "That's extremely well done," she said. "Now marry me before I cry on this dress." They spoke the words in front of everyone who had become their people, and the afternoon light came through Margaret's windows and fell across everything in that particular way that important moments have, of making light look like it knows what it's doing. And outside the window, the Silver Creek Valley lay green and quiet and alive. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because nothing real is. There were hard winters and lean seasons and the ordinary complexity of two stubborn, particular people building a life together, learning each other's silences, negotiating the small jurisdictions of a shared existence, finding the places where they were different, and the places where they were, surprisingly, identical. There were arguments that were honest and reconciliations that were better for the honesty. There were decisions that cost something and paid off slowly, and others that paid off immediately and cost something later. Elias finished the house in the valley the following spring, and they moved in on a Sunday in April when the live oak was in full leaf and the view south across the grassland was everything it had promised to be. Clara arranged her books on the shelf in the parlor, her mother's books, and all the others she had accumulated at Silver Creek Ranch, and several that Elias had quietly acquired for her, leaving them on her desk without comment, which was how he did most of the things he loved most. She set her mother's hairbrush on the dressing table in the bedroom and stood at the south-facing window and looked at her land, their land, and felt the rightness of it in her bones. The school grew. By the following year, it had 34 students and had outgrown the first building, and Samuel Cole made good on his promise. A proper schoolhouse, larger, with 2 windows and a real stove and a porch where children could eat their midday meal in good weather. Families came from as far as 15 miles. Clara hired a second teacher, a young woman from San Antonio named Miriam, 20 years old, sharp-eyed and quick-minded, and supervised the curriculum with the exacting standards of someone who understands that education is not a charity, but a right. Tomas, who had taught himself to read from a seed catalog in a world that offered him little else, went on to study at a school in San Antonio at 18. He wrote to Clara every month without fail for the rest of her life, And she wrote back, and his letters are the clearest evidence of what a teacher can do when she treats a child as exactly what he is, someone capable of more than anyone around him has yet imagined. Bobby grew up and became, improbably and perfectly, a teacher himself. Silas Dodd was indicted on fraud charges in the spring following the hearing on the basis of the evidence that Price had assembled and the district attorney had built upon. He was convicted and fined a sum that did not come close to accounting for what he had taken from people, which is often how justice works. Incomplete, better than nothing, a line drawn where no line had been before. He left the region afterward and was not heard from again in those counties, which was the best available outcome and the one Clara had been realistic enough to hope for. She never forgot the street in Red Hollow. She was not built for the comfortable amnesia of people who prefer their past to be tidy. She remembered it the way you remember anything that changed you, fully, clearly, without the softening that time sometimes applies to things that were too sharp to live with otherwise. She remembered her wrists and the rope and the crowd and the sun pressing down, and she remembered the voice from the back of the crowd that she had first heard before she saw the face it belonged to. She made of it what she could, which was considerable. Their first daughter was born in February of the second year, in the bedroom of the house in the valley, in the hour before dawn when everything is still and the world seems to be pausing to make room for something new. Elias sat beside the bed through the whole of it, holding Clara's hand with a steadiness that was, she thought later, the most unambiguous expression of love she had ever witnessed, simply being there, completely, without flinching, for all of it. When the baby was placed in her arms, Clara looked at the small face, the extraordinary, ordinary face of a new person arriving, deciding to be here, and felt something that had no adequate name in any of her books, even Shakespeare, even the poetry. Something that was beyond the specific gravity of romantic love, beyond gratitude, beyond the satisfaction of work well done. Something that was simply the weight of life continuing itself forward through a woman who had once been sold in a street and had refused to let that be the last word. Elias was looking at both of them. "What do we call her?" he asked. His voice had a quality she'd never heard in it before. The voice of a man standing in the presence of something that has undone him completely and finding it the best thing that has ever happened. Clara looked at the baby. She thought of her mother and her father and all the distances between what people dream and what they live, and all the ways that love persists through those distances, imperfect and real. "Ruth," she said, "after my mother." Elias reached out and touched the baby's cheek with one finger, the same hands that had cut a rope, that had framed a school, that had laid a foundation stone by patient stone in a hidden valley. Ruth turned her face toward the touch with the instinctive trust of something new to the world. "Ruth Hart," Elias said. "Ruth Hart," Clara agreed. Outside, the Texas sky was going from black to the first gray of dawn, and the valley was quiet, and the live oak stood in the dark with its arms spread wide over the house, and the creek ran full and cold a quarter-mile east, and 34 children would come to school in 6 hours and find their slates waiting and their teacher's handwriting on the board, steady and clear. What began with a rope in a street ended with this: a woman who had been reduced to a price and refused to stay reduced, a man who had let silence cost him something and spent the rest of his life speaking up, a child new to the world in a house built by hand, and all around them the proof that one brave decision, one person stepping forward when everyone else stepped back, can move through a life and a community and a generation like water through dry ground. Not loudly, not with the drama of legend, just steadily, thoroughly. The way things grow when they are tended by people who believe in them. The way things last.